Well, we'll get started, and hopefully a few people other people will join us. Thank you for coming and spending this time. I think it's going to be a fun evening. This is the first of a Living Sanctuary series with a different theme this week, and I'll come back to this theme at the end, but just to give you an idea of what's coming next week, our guests are going to be talking about immigration rights and Black Lives Matter. We'll have Sarai Bravo, who's a dreamer, an activist, and an organizer besides her full-time job. And Christopher Vergara, who, besides his full-time job, works with the Sanctuary Amparo Ministry of our Metropolitan New York Synod. We're also going to have an evening on immigrant worker rights. And then we're going to have three rock star pastors, Annalise Triolo, Sarah Garrett Cray, and Kelsey Brown, talking about work-life balance and self-care in these days. But tonight, we have Wendy Kaplan, who is a licensed social worker, who's the director of Trinity Place Shelter. She began here in 2010 as an intern. She became the assistant director, and she has been our director for the past year. And we also have Ross Murray, who is an ELCA deacon. He's the senior director of the GLAAD Media Institute and one of the founding directors of the Naming Project. We also have Alyssa Terry, who's a student at Union Theological Seminary, and she also has done and is doing field work here, both at the shelter and the church. And she's gonna help with the nuts and bolts for tonight, which may be a learning curve for us, because this is the first time that we have done this. So now it's 7:35, and we can begin.
Including the learning curve, for
Yes.
Amy and Ann who have joined us, did you ask for you a password for you?
They
No?
can't hear them.
Okay.
Oh,
No, no, it did not ask for a password, and I can't figure out how to turn my camera on.
No worries.
So the way that evening's gonna go is first Ross is going to talk with us about his work. Wendy's gonna speak about her work. I'm gonna read a really short section from my book, and then we'll have a brief Q&A, and then we'll be done. So Ross, will begin with you. We can't hear you. Ross needs to be
Of course. Right when I think I'll have it together, it's not together. Thank you, first of all, for inviting me to be a part of this conversation, and for the wonderful book that you wrote, talking so much about the church year, your community inside the church, your community outside of the church, and wider issues like politics and how we all live our lives together and who's leading us. My work is with GLAAD, and I've been there for just about 10 years now. I'm now the senior director at the GLAAD Media Institute, so I do a lot of training and education, and that takes different forms. On one side, I work a lot with activists and advocates, learning how to use media as a tool for their advocacy, how to make sure they can tell their story effectively, how they can make social media work for them as opposed to feeling like they're working against it. GLAAD also does a lot of work with media companies like journalists or filmmakers or script runners, things like that. It's a little bit more somewhere else in the organization, but I get involved with a little bit of it. And we'll do some work with companies that want to support LGBTQ equality and acceptance. And that's really what GLAAD is working for, is acceptance. And I've always found there's this relationship between legal recognition, equal rights, and the perception or the level of acceptance that people are feeling. And that's what we tend to work on. I am not an inherently political person. I actually don't like politics a whole lot. But I have found that that we need to have enough cultural change so that we can enact the policy change that is going to protect those who are the most marginalized. If we could all treat each other well and we could understand fairness and equity and justice and be able to live that out, then we wouldn't necessarily need laws and policies to govern our life. Sadly, we live in a broken, sinful world where we do need the law outside of ourselves to help guide us as individuals and as people. And so there's this odd relationship that I sort of find between the two. And we work for cultural change in order to pass laws or policies. But then once we do that, we have to do enough cultural change to live into that law or policy change that we made. And it's this like constant cycle that goes over and over and over again. We cannot force people, we can't legislate people to be nice to each other. We can't legislate acceptance or kindness. That is something that only comes from the heart, from understanding who we are. And by GLAAD, we do that by making sure that the stories of the LGBTQ community and the most marginalized within the LGBTQ community get told. And so you get some of those stories in Heidi's book, talking about the people that are in ministry with her, people from the shelter, people in the congregation, people in the neighborhood. And then we kind of go macro out to this level. And the fact that we're in an election year, that we are 28 days away from the end of this election cycle, is making sure that we have people understand what is at stake for the LGBTQ community. And folks like me, white, cisgender, gay guys, are probably gonna be okay no matter what happens, but I always think of who are the folks that are most marginalized. When the Trump administration began in 2017, GLAAD created something called the Trump Accountability Project, just so reporters had a listing of the ways and the places where the LGBTQ community was being attacked. On Inauguration Day, the White House website, the page for the website that said LGBTQ was erased and deleted while the inauguration was going on. And since then, we've counted 125 attacks. Some of them are policies. There are things like a transgender military ban. They are allowing doctors to refuse to treat LGBTQ people. They give a definition of sex that says it is the genitals that you are born with and you cannot change it, coming through Health and Human Services. People need to know that. People need to be aware of that. And I have found with folks, with good Christian, well-meaning folks, they don't really know this. We've looked a lot at marriage equality as sort of the benchmark for the LGBTQ community. And that was a huge win and a big step forward in 2015. And at that point, people kind of thought, well, then the movement's over. You're completely equal. Everything's fine, right? And this is where GLAAD really leaned into acceptance, is that marriage equality is a great privilege and a great benefit and a great right that we have. But that is something that benefits a few people. It benefits folks that are in a relationship. It doesn't secure basic protections like employment to keep people from being harassed or attacked as they're walking down the street. And so part of it is having to bring that back up to people just to let them know how much more work there is to do. I think the Trump administration actually made that easier. There's been much more that's been much more visible in terms of attacks on minority groups, including the LGBTQ community. But I also really have thought in terms of the fact that a lot of people still don't understand or grasp the scope of those attacks. So I don't ever want to sound like a downer, but I'm kind of the person that follows the news. And then when we're at, social events or whatever, saying something like, someone sees a headline and I can say, oh, here's what's actually happening behind that. And why I think that our work toward justice as Christians, as Lutherans, as people that are following Jesus in whatever way that we can, means that we are going to have to not just look at our individual charity and those good things that we can do individually. I think those charity pieces are helpful, but we're also going to have to look at the systems that makes people have to need that charity. That we're going to have to look at What is the ways that we have assumed that our lives are just governed? What are the ways that we assume that everyone gets a fair shot, and seeing that that's not actually true? And it's going to be hard. It's going to take a lot of difficult conversations. It's going to be understanding the amount of privilege that a lot of us carry, people like me carry, and having the foresight and the strategy and the ingenuity to tear down what's not working for people and building up that's something new and better, and actually looking to be led perhaps from those folks on the margins. And so what we're glad is with that is, let's have a forum to be able to do that. Let's have that conversation in news coverage about marginalized groups in the LGBTQ community. Let's have fictionalized stories that can tell the story of LGBTQ people. One example of that has been Pose, that has shined a spotlight on queer and transgender people of color that no other fictional show has done before. And this is a family drama. And these are characters that we get to know and we love and we hate, and like the same thing we do with all the rest of those TV shows. But it is a glimpse into the reality of a world, even though it's fictional. And I think that's the thing that starts to reach hearts and minds. The hard part is not everyone watches Pose. I think they should. I think it's a great show. But how do we get in front of people that want to see the world with their same blinders on? How do we let them know what forms of injustice and inequality still exist? And then also let them know what are the things that they can do about it now if they're feeling that uncomfortable. So I think this book kind of does that. It does a little bit of letting people feel uncomfortable, but also starting to point toward what are the things that we do. And with an election, that's going to be one of those steps. Voting an election does not solve all the problems that we have as a country or as a city or as a state or as a world. But I do think it's one of those tangible pieces that makes sure that we can demonstrate that we're not giving up hope, and that we pray that God is going to provide us enough grace as we are working our individual acts of charity while we are voting for leaders that can help to enact change, that are going to give more people a fair shot to live their full and abundant life in this world. And we challenge those laws and policies and systems that have kept folks marginalized and kept other people with a great amount of privilege. And so it seems amorphous because it is. GLAAD is a media organization. We see that media shapes culture and understanding and awareness and acceptance. And so that's the work that we do. And I'll briefly say, you mentioned the naming project. That's that like individual piece. It's a micro piece. We run a summer camp for LGBTQ youth, 20 youth in a summertime, who get to have an experience where they focus on who am I, how do I relate to God, how do I relate to the rest of the world, while getting to have that church camp experience. And so I really like the balance of the of the church camp that gets to affect 20 young people at one time, and GLAAD's work that is the media that is being spread out to millions, in some cases billions of people. And I think that tension is really helpful for what we do. And so that's what I want to say just to get us started off. I'm excited for the conversation, and I want to hear what everyone else has to say.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I think a lot more people should hear what you just said, and we can all help with that because this is being recorded. So although there are not a lot of people listening right now, we can all share it and make it available for other people to hear it. It's so important. Wendy, your turn. We can't hear you, Wendy.
Okay, so I am so thrilled to be here, particularly in connection with your book, which is beautiful and important. And so I'm excited to talk about the shelter here tonight with everybody. I wanted to tell folks why we need a shelter. Why is there a shelter in Trinity Lutheran Church of Manhattan for queer homeless youth? And who lives in the shelter and what we do in the shelter. So I'm gonna briefly speak to those three questions. So first, why do we need a shelter? So we have in this country, we have an enormous homeless youth population in this country. If you look at the entire population of homeless youth, by homeless youth, I'm talking about unaccompanied youth, not the youth who are living with families in family shelters. But of these unaccompanied youth, you have this pie, and 40% identifies LGBTQ. So when you think about that statistic, if maybe 7% of the population, the whole population, identifies LGBTQ, this statistic is staggering and grossly disproportionate. So the number one reason or cause of homelessness, as you can imagine, is rejection from your family of origin. So that is why we have this very disproportionate and very sad statistic. So these young people face a desperate need for safe housing and shelter. And sadly, our general population shelters are not safe for most LGBT youth. So I've heard countless stories over the years at my time at Trinity from our residents who've told stories of being bullied, being verbally harassed, physically assaulted, sexually assaulted, just for their perceived gender orientation or their gender expression. So it's vital that our youth have a safe, nurturing space to heal from the multiple layers of trauma, and most directly, the trauma of rejection from their families of origin and of homelessness. So in New York City, there's very few shelters for homeless youth, or we say youth experiencing homelessness. And certainly there's even fewer beds for those who are LGBT. Thus, it's critical that Trinity Place Shelter exists and that we have this safe, affirming refuge that allows the young people to live with us to get a meaningful foothold out of homelessness. So who lives at Trinity Place Shelter? So when we think of homeless people, typically we have an image come to mind, and I'm gonna guess that it may not be the image of that very handsome person serving you your Starbucks coffee, or the very charming and friendly food server at your local restaurant. But we tend to have a misperception of who is homeless, what homelessness is, and the tenuous line that there really is. So our residents are those beautiful people who are working behind the counter, offering you help at Target, or maybe you're interfacing with them at a local non-for-profit. So that's, first of all, who's living at Trinity Place Shelter. So about 2/3 of Trinity Place Shelter residents are from the tri-state area in New York City. About 1/3 are from all over the United States, including other countries around the world as well. So typically the folks who are coming from other states are coming from the South. We also have, so those folks and folks from other countries are coming here for refuge, for sanctuary, and not just from their families of origin who aren't accepting or reacting in violence to their identity, but from their larger communities where it's not safe for them to live. So they come to New York and ultimately to Trinity Place seeking refuge. We've had residents from all over the world. We've had people come from Central America fleeing gang violence where they were specifically targeted. Their identity was revealed and they knew they would be killed if they didn't flee. We've had folks from the West Indies who've watched so many of their friends victimized or killed by homophobia, transphobia, and knew if they didn't flee, they also may be killed. So it's been a refuge, a sanctuary for people experiencing violence of one kind or another for over 14 years. So thinking about Trinity Place and who lives here, there's also some trends. Black and Latinx youth are disproportionately affected by homelessness. About 85% of Trinity Place Shelter residents identify as Black and Latinx. And well over half of our residents identify as transgender, gender nonconforming, non-binary. All of our residents have different needs, interests. Some are still in high school, some, because now they have a safe, stable place to live, are starting college again or can apply to college. Some are working, some are looking for work. So everybody's story is different. So let me speak now to what we do at Trinity Place. So first and foremost, the most critical foundation which we provide at Trinity is, which all of our work spans from, is by establishing an environment that is affirming, that is nurturing and stable. So this is an environment in which our residents can heal. They're all arriving at Trinity Place with multiple layers of trauma, and it's vital that our staff are appropriately trained to meet all of their needs. So one of the very unique things about Trinity Place is that our staff are all social workers, all of whom work with full hearts and give so much to Trinity Place. At Trinity Place, the first thing we do is meet these basic needs of safety, access to food, showers, a place to, closets to store your belongings with a key, transportation. We give everyone a Metro card so they can get to their job, they can get to their therapist, they can get to the job interview. And then we connect residents, whether it's through our on-site staff and interns or through our partnering agencies in the community. We provide vital resources to our residents, such as resume building, job development skills, interview skills, connecting them with legal support, medical, financial literacy. So counseling, of course, which they can get on-site and elsewhere. So our residents can stay up to 18 months. And this is a significant amount of time when compared with other youth shelters. So most other youth shelters, I'm so sorry, it's the outdoor buzzer. That's what happens when you Zoom. Most other youth shelters, you can stay for 90 days, but at Trinity Place, staying 18 months really gives a significant amount of time to really get a meaningful foothold out of the cycle of homelessness. So that's sort of a little portrait of why we need this shelter, who lives there, and what we do. And I welcome any questions that folks have and look forward to continuing the discussion.
I was muted. Thank you, Wendy. Building on what Wendy shared, I'm going to read a very brief section from my book that talks about how the shelter got started. It's called, the chapter is called Leap Before You Look. It was the last Sunday of June in 2004, the day of New York City's Pride Parade. I sat drinking my early morning coffee, part of an introvert routine that includes prayer, breakfast, and a few non-challenging pieces in the Sunday Times, Vows, Modern Love, when I saw the headline, "For young gays on the streets, survival comes before pride. Few beds for growing class of homeless." The article noted that as mainstream media becomes more LGBTQIA+ friendly, more youth come out to their families only to find themselves rejected, often kicked to the street, quote, "a growing legion of the disowned and the dispossessed, most of them Black and Latino, an increasing number of them HIV positive, and still in the throes of adolescence." What really shocked me was the detail that in a city of over 8 million people, there were only a few dozen beds available for this particular population of nearly 10,000. Other shelters were often unsafe, with queer young people bullied by staff and even urinated on as they slept. I thought of my own adolescent children safe in their beds, and my heart seized. On the other hand, what could I do? What could we do? I had my sermon planned, but now I felt compelled to share what I'd learned about the plight of homeless queer youth. The response I received after worship told me that I was not the only one who longed to take action. Recognizing that churches had created much of this problem, Trinity wanted to be part of the solution, but it didn't seem realistic. Our century-old building desperately needed repairs. We had a daunting budgetary deficit. What could we possibly do? The following year, a call went forth for faith communities to open their doors for 1 week during some of the coldest nights of winter, accommodating the overflow from the few existing shelters. This opportunity fit our limited resources. Our intern, Chris Wogeman, eagerly coordinated the effort, having once experienced homelessness as a young gay man in the city. At some point during our first week of providing shelter, which stretched into 3, we began to imagine doing more. We could not count on a better resource congregation to care for these youth. When the call went out to religious institutions throughout the city to open their doors for 1 week, only 3 churches responded positively. Based on the others I spoke with, most deemed it too much of a risk. In some cases, the church approval process had so many layers and was so lengthy that by the time the decision makers had calculated all the risks and arrived at their decision, the winter crisis would have passed. Opening Trinity Place was not a controversial issue for the majority of my congregation, whose concerns mostly revolved around the practical, like space sharing and finances. Kevin Lotz, our vice president and a social worker, mitigated any further anxieties when he presented an extremely thorough plan and assumed the role of shelter director. I did worry, however, about the response from our newer immigrant members who had been raised in more conservative church culture. When we had a meeting to discuss the proposal after our Spanish worship service one Sunday, it was clear that nobody wanted to be branded as prejudiced. People veiled their concerns by saying things like, "I'm not personally opposed to this, but I bet my friends and family might be, and thus the shelter might impede our desired outreach and growth." I listened with a sinking heart. I wanted to mention Mexico's rich history among its indigenous cultures of accepting varied sexual orientations and what today might be considered as genderqueer persons going back to pre-Columbian times when cross-dressing Aztecs led worship and people celebrated Mayan gods who belie the colonial gender binary. It seemed to me that homophobia and transphobia arrived along with the Spanish conquistadores. But before I could get up to speak, Juana stood up. "You know, in other churches, everyone is separate. There's a mass in one language and a mass in another language, and people don't even talk to each other. Here we are welcomed and the church wants to worship together." We had provided Juana's first experience of regular bilingual worship, something she now treasured. When Juana's father died, her grief was intensified. Being undocumented meant that she could not return to Mexico for the funeral. She asked if we could have our own memorial service, even though, as she said, sadly, hardly anyone would attend since nobody here knew him. At her insisting, we made only a handful of worship bulletins. We quickly made more on the day of the service when the pews began filling beyond expectations. I led the worship in Spanish, but many of the people attending spoke only English. Their presence was poignantly eloquent. At our meeting for the shelter proposal, Juana concluded, "I used to be uncomfortable around gay people, but here my mind has changed. People are people, and everyone deserves to be treated with respect and love. We know what it's like to be unwanted, but here we have been welcomed. So we should welcome these rejected young people with nowhere else to go." It turned out that the pastor didn't need to give a hectoring history lesson. The vote in favor of the shelter was unanimous. On June 12, 2006, Trinity Place Shelter opened, and served its first dinner to the youth, a feast of tortillas, salad, rice, and chicken mole, lovingly prepared by the Mexican church mothers. So now we have time for any questions. If any of you listening have any questions you'd like to ask, particularly Ross or Wendy, or me too, if you'd like.
Ross, you mentioned something about um, having things led by the marginalized. Could you expand on that?
Yeah, I think in some ways it's been a bit of examination of my own privilege. Um, I, I love speaking, I love leading, I like doing this, but I realize more and more that we default a lot toward white men, and I'm a gay man, but and they have a lot of positions of power in media, society, politics, culture, right? All of that. And recognizing, especially this year in an election year, I know more marginalized folks and marginalized identities, part of the struggle is to convince them that their vote or their action does or means anything, because it kind of feels like the wheels of our society just kind of like move and they are crushed under it or kind of swept up in it. And I've kind of more and more have been like, you know, white men have been leading things for a really long time, and things are not great. So maybe other folks, it's time to take over. And I don't want to say that in an advocating way of like, go take care of it now, but I think making sure that we've got leadership that is actually reflecting our fuller society, which is women, which is people of color, which is LGBTQ people, which is people with disabled people, and making sure that they're the ones that are going to make the decisions on what sorts of policies or the ways that we want to structure our life, or making the decisions for us. Because I think they're going to make different decisions than I do, because I'm a safe person. And I think that what's safe for me is not inherently what is safe for somebody else. And so that's where I'm trying to use whatever privilege I have or position, and GLAAD is a good way of doing this, to amplify or tell the story or give someone the spotlight. I've always said GLAAD is a good organization to get attention. Like we can like get the spotlight. And now I see using that as a mirror, that we can actually reflect that spotlight onto someone that you wouldn't actually know and get to hear and learn their story and have them set the tone of the conversation. So that's kind of what I mean when I talk about taking over.
A follow-up related to that for Wendy, you mentioned voting and people like feeling, is their vote even going to count? Wendy, what's happening with the young people in the shelter in terms of the vote?
Yeah, actually, I'm great timing that you asked that question, because we've all of the residents who aren't registered, we've registered or had them register to vote. And we have residents voting in swing states. We have residents with absentee ballots. We're voting in red states. So, so I'm very happy that Trinity Place Shelter is getting out the vote. I was there the night when Obama was elected. And that was a beautiful evening I'll never forget. And yeah, and this time it's very different. I think the tone is very somber, and people are feeling very disenfranchised. But I think it was very important when we did sort of this rally to vote, that people realized like, okay, this matters. Actually, in this election, my voice matters, and getting an absentee ballot. So that's exciting. Maybe Trinity Place can swing the state.
Great. Any other questions for anybody?
I have a question for you, Heidi. can you talk about, and just in terms of writing the book, framing this around the liturgical year? I love the liturgical year. So like anytime someone uses it as a device, I think it's great. But can you talk about how you were thinking of pairing all these stories with these seasons and celebrations?
Sure. Well, I kind of for me works in two directions. On the one hand, we're living through one kind of season these days that's not the season of the church year. That's a difficult season in many ways. And I grew up in church with, all churches don't celebrate the seasons of the church year, but I grew up in the Lutheran church, which does. And I just have always found going through the seasons of the church year breathe a certain life and hope into the season we are living through, and also remind us that there's more going on than meets the eye. What's happening in the White House today, as horrific as it is, does not have the final word over our lives. So I find the seasons of the church year bring me a lot of life and hope. And so I wanted to share that with others, and I wanted to share it in a way that seemed very concrete and real, rather than some weird ethereal thing. But also it's true, which you could tell in the book, that I think what's happening in the world around us should inform how we celebrate the seasons of the church year. So for instance, last Christmas, our creche, a nativity scene, we got a dog cage and put baby Jesus on one side and Mary and Joseph on the other side. So it's the Christmas creche, but it's connecting to what's going on today. And we try to do that with really with every season.
Yeah, I've kind of found that like the liturgical year has been a good way to put, it takes a lot of wild and chaotic news that just seems like a fire hose and perhaps puts it into a little bit of perspective and
Yes.
lets you process it in a particular way. I know this was a social media post that people said this year, this was the lentiest Lent I've ever lented. And I felt that was like real. It's a good time for reflection and for penitence, and that makes a lot of sense to me.
Yeah, exactly. I actually at one point was going to call the book thinking of Rent, Seasons of Love, and my editor, like, I guess Googled seasons of, I like Sanctuary now much more, but Googled seasons of love, and it came up a lot of romance novels. So they were like, no, that's, your book confused for a romance novel. So that didn't work out, but yeah. Any other questions for anybody? Well, I think, both of you, Wendy and Ross, your witness is so powerful, so important, and so hopeful. And I think it's really something people need to hear in the midst of all the garbage that we're hearing every day. So I encourage all of us to share this, because it really is something people need to hear. And both of you, your work is so important, and I'm so thankful for it. It really makes such a big difference. And I think in the chat is Alyssa, are there?
I posted in the chat Heidi's website, as well as the GLAAD website, as well as Trinity Place Shelter and Trinity Church's websites for any of you to visit at any point in time.
Great. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
And if anybody wants to get my book, you can obviously get it on Amazon, but I would really like to give a shout out, not just for my book, but for any book that you were thinking of buying, to bookshop.org. Bookshop.org, I never had heard of it before someone in my church alerted me to it. It's an online book selling site. the prices are usually a little lower than Amazon. They deliver as quickly as Amazon, but the best thing is a portion of every purchase is donated to an independent bookstore. And you can choose the independent bookstore you want it donated to when you buy your book. Or if you don't do that, they look at your zip code and they locate the closest independent bookstore. Since January, they've raised over $1 million for independent bookstores. So it's absolutely, I buy a lot of books. I'm probably more books than I should buy, but this is just fantastic. Like, you're buying books and doing good work in the world at the same time. So bookshop.org for whatever book you'd like to buy, which doesn't have to be mine, but it's great if it's mine. Yeah, and I think we'll all go out there. And Alyssa, how will we get a copy? Where will a copy of this be available so we can share it?
That is up to you, either Facebook or YouTube.
Anyone have any thoughts on that? What's the better way to do it? Maybe YouTube.
If it's YouTube, then it can be shared across the other platforms from YouTube a little bit easier.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. No, but for people that are listening now, how will they find it?
You will need to go to Trinity's YouTube page, which I will send to you right now.
Okay.
We can also put a link on the church's website and on the shelter's website.
Right, and I can put it on my webpage.
Yes.
Mhm. Yeah. We
Okay.
put the video on our website too.
Yeah,
I think that would be a great start.
that would be great.
Yeah.
It's so great. Thank you both so much. And thank you not just for taking this time, but for the work you do. And thank you to those of you who did make time to come out tonight. Thank you.
Thanks, Heidi.
Thank you, Alyssa.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Good night.
Good night. Good night.
Good night.